Chapter 5, the American Revolution. So, the colonies have the Second Continental Congress, and not all the people wanted independence at the beginning. Some people wanted to have peace with Britain. They wanted to redress the grievances in the British Empire. Some of them wanted independence, but not many of them. So what they did was, they did the Olive Branch Petition, which asked the king for peace, but he flatly refused. He decided to enact the British Prohibitory Act instead, which closed the colonies to all overseas trade. So most of the people in the colonies didn't really want independence, but a lot of that changed when Thomas Paine wrote his pamphlet called Common Sense. He made the idea of independence from Britain common sense to Americans. To the colonists, but they would soon be Americans. So, they wrote the Declaration of Independence later on, which declared a formal break from England. It listed grievances against the king, and it was written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, but also by Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. So again, not everybody in the colonies wanted independence. Some of them stayed loyal to the king, and they called themselves loyalists, but the patriots who supported independence called them Tories. So, in the colonies, the states have increased their colonial self-government, which they already had, and they had their own constitutions as well. But despite having strong state governments, they were uncertain of whether they wanted a national government, because they didn't want anybody to become tyranny. They didn't want to be their tyranny like the British king or the British Constitution, unwritten Constitution anyway. So, but if they were going to have a war, they needed that central authority. So what they did was they wrote up the Articles of Confederation, which basically just confirmed the weak decentralized system they already had. The challenges they faced included raising armies, getting supplies, and the expenses. And they had a lot of shortages, and they got a lot of their supplies from France and other countries. And in order to finance the war, they tried by printing paper money, but that failed because of inflation. So in the end, they paid for the war by borrowing from other nations. And then, they had their state militias, but that wasn't very organized. So they created the Continental Army to nationalize the war effort, and they made George Washington the commander-in-chief. He had earned his status because what he had done in the French and Indian War. He was a symbol of stability. He not only held the army together, but he also held the nation together as a whole. So, the British had a lot of advantages, but the Americans also had advantages of their own in the war. They were fighting on their own ground. They were committed to the war. Britain was not as committed to the war. They didn't want to pay so much money to engage in the war. And Americans also had substantial aid from abroad, especially from France. So, the first phase of the war is New England. It was basically the year of 1775. In the Battle of Bunker Hill, American forces besieged the British Army, which was led by General Thomas Gage at Boston. At this point, England was not sure if this was an actual war or not. They felt like they were just quashing rebellions and such. So in the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British suffered heavy casualties, and yeah. So the Americans unsuccessfully tried to invade Canada to remove the British threat and gain Canadian support, but like I said, that failed. The Canadians were not to become part of the new country. Then England realizes it must be prepared to fight a war on a much larger scale. Second phase is the Mid-Atlantic region, which is from the year 1776 to 1778. During this phase of the war, British are in the best position to win, but they did not because of a lot of blunders. So, the British general William Howe, he surrounds New York City with his formidable British forces from the sea. George Washington gets a small army, but it's unsuccessful, and the British take New York City. So the British settle down for the winter. They don't, the British are seasonal fighters. Okay, we don't fight on Sundays, blah. Anyway, the British settle down for the winter and leave Hessians or German mercenaries at Trenton. So Washington's American forces don't fight by their rules. So Washington surprises them, takes Trenton, but only temporarily. So Britain's new strategy is to divide the colonies. William Howe moves north from New York City, while another British force goes south from Canada. So to divide the northern colonies from the southern ones. However, William Howe, he just flatly abandons this plan and launches an assault on Philadelphia instead. He does that in hopes of quickly ending the war, but that doesn't happen. So he occupies Philadelphia, and then the Continental Army has winter quarters at Valley Forge, where they suffer a lot of disease, and they're very short on supplies. So it's a very tough time at Valley Forge during that winter. So British General Burgoyne sends... So because William Howe abandoned the effort, General Burgoyne sends Colonel Barry St. Leger up the St. Lawrence River, while he advanced down from the upper Hudson Valley. He seizes Fort Ticonderoga, and there the Americans remove their General Philip Schuyler and replace him with Horatio Gates. Burgoyne suffers defeats at Oriskany and Bennington. And then, this is a very major point. He surrendered at Saratoga when the American forces, led by Horatio Gates, surrounded him. The surrender at Saratoga, British surrender at Saratoga, is when the Americans win convincingly enough that France decides to become a formal ally of America, and that this is crucial to America's success at winning this war. So the Iroquois Confederacy is like, the Indians, they're splitting apart. Half of them have allied with the British. And this is a demonstration of growing divisions between the Iroquois Confederacy because of all the individual nations. They're just not agreeing with each other anymore, apparently. So, the third phase, the South. At this point, the British are much less committed to the war. So, what they do is they focus on trying to get loyalists to their side, but this failed. There were more patriots in the area than they expected, and they tried enlisting slaves, but that made the white masters angry. So the white masters, who may have been loyalists, were not loyal anymore, and so they caused more conflict there. Excuse me. I'm sorry. So then, This made the war more revolutionary because it gave more people reason to support the war. In this phase, the British will win some battles, but they're constantly harassed by the Americans and their guerrilla tactics. They don't fight like the British do. So, there's a General Nathaniel Greene, who is a major American general in the South. Okay, and then we are close to the end of the actual war. So, Cornwallis, the British general, the Americans and the French trap him at Yorktown. The French have their navy in the seas, and the Americans are surrounding him by land. So, General Cornwallis surrenders to American troops. And that is basically the end of the war, but we don't get a peace settlement until 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris, 1783. So, consequences of the war. Because the Americans won, lots of the Loyalists moved back to Britain. The Anglican Church, as well as the Quakers, were weakened in areas where they were the official religion. They were not anymore, particularly the Anglican Church. On the other hand, the Roman Catholic Church is a bit strengthened, although it's not like the official religion, but it was strengthened. So, African Americans, they want freedom, and they sometimes resisted white control in this period, but they would not get their freedom until much later in U.S. history. And so, this led to the issue of liberty versus slavery. The Declaration of Independence said all men are created equal, but how is that compatible with slavery? How can both of them be possible? But they had their reasons. Some people thought that keeping the blacks enslaved was the only way to let whites have liberty. Many Indians were neutral, though some sided with the British. They sided with the British because they were less hostile than the Americans. They felt they were less likely to be encroached upon by the British than by the Americans. However, since the Americans won the war, the Patriots are seeking more land, encroaching on the Indian lands. So, whatever relations they did have with the Indians, they are going down quickly. However, within the Indians themselves, there are a lot of divisions, so it's difficult for them to unite against the Americans. So, when some of them followed their husbands and relatives to the camp, and they helped with. However, though George Washington didn't want them there, the army benefited by them being there. They did cooking and laundry and nursing, and sometimes even participated in combat, but this didn't really. After the war, it didn't really strengthen the rights of women. Abigail Adams in particular called for women's rights to her husband, but the war actually strengthened patriarchal society and kept women in their place, so to speak. Women were valued as mothers and needed to raise their children and things like that. They didn't believe that the women had equal, again with the equality, and apparently all men are created equal, but not women quite yet. So, as far as the economy goes, there were no imperial restrictions on them anymore. So they had a wide range of markets. They were already trading with other markets legally, but now they could do it freely. And there was also an increase in some American industries, like their clothes, their homespun, became much more fashionable, and their manufacturing grew as well. So, the view of republicanism views that power comes from the people rather than a supreme authority. Also, the concept of equality, there's no equality of condition. Like, everybody's born in different circumstances, but there's equality of opportunity. Everybody has the opportunity to gain success. So there were written state constitutions, which had strong legislatures but limited executive power. However, they made changes. They did a special assembly to write the Constitution so that the legislature, writing the Constitution, they wouldn't be able to circumvent it, so to speak. And so then Thomas Jefferson proposes the Statute of Religious Liberty, which calls for a complete separation of church and state. So in some of the northern states where slavery is like almost non-existent, slavery is like banned, they're prohibited, but slavery survives in all the southern and border states. So the Articles of Confederation are weak. They have no ability to regulate trade, draft troops, or levy taxes. And the British are continuing to occupy some of the outposts, and there's a dispute over the border between Spanish Florida and the United States. So they made a treaty recognizing the Spanish possessions, and it also limited U.S. travel on the Mississippi River. So then there was the issue of land. People wanted to move west, So the Ordinance of 1784 divided the Western Territory into 10 self-governing districts, who could then petition to become a state once they became large enough. So then the Ordinance of 1785 came out with a system for surveying and selling Western land. And the way they divided that land was using something called the grid, which was division of land into carefully measured and evenly divided squares and rectangles. That's why a lot of the western states are more square, and the ones on the east are more based on like rivers and things like that. Then there was the Northwest Ordinance, which abandoned the district system and created a single Northwest Territory, which could then be divided in 3 to 5 territories. So they had treaties with the Indians about the land, who ceded their territory to the U.S. Not voluntarily, really. But the treaties, they were ineffective. The Indians still resisted the white encroachment. They still wanted their land. So when the Indians rebel in the Ohio River Valley, the whites defeat them in the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which is then supposedly fixed by the Treaty of Greenville. And back to the economy again a little bit. The post-war depression, because they needed to pay for the war, there's like no money. So they attempted to tax to pay for the war, but it failed. And there were problems on the state as well as the national level concerning taxes. So a man named Daniel Shays, he demands paper money, tax relief, a moratorium on debt, etc. However, he and his group of people, they were denounced as traitors. So then they led a rebellion, and militiamen defeated them. The rebellion was mostly a failure, though some concessions were granted. This rebellion added urgency to the need to produce a national constitution. And that's what next time will be about, the Constitution.